Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another episode review from the classic 90s Goosebumps TV show we all know and love. And this episode comes from Season 3. It was written by Charles Lazer and directed by William Fruitt, and it is The Barking Ghost. Now, since Ghost Beach is the only DVD I don't have individually, I only have it in a dual pack, I'll be using this as a point of reference. But if you turn it on the back, on the Ghost Beach portion, it says it includes The Barking Ghost. So that's why I'm holding this up here. Now, the Barking Ghost episode, I'm going to be honest, next to Vampire Breath, is the pretty much biggest episode I forget even exists in this TV show, honestly. It's so unremarkable and forgettable that it's not worth even storing it in my memory. And I always forget what this episode does. Each and every time I'll watch it, kind of remember it for a few weeks, and then it falls off my brain. I will say this now, after rewatching this episode, I have no interest in ever coming back to it because it's not even worth it. If I'm being honest. This is just a painfully mediocre truncation of a painfully bad Goosebumps book. Now, is it a little bit better? Sure, and I think a lot of people would agree with that. I'm going to save a lot what I want to say in the book versus episode video, but if you haven't seen this episode before, you're not missing much. There's not a lot to this episode, if I'm being honest, y'all. And the fact that this is tied to William Fruitt saddens me, because I love William Fruitt. I love his work he did in the original show, and this is, you know, by and large, I think his worst episode. And it helps that it's forgettable. So that way I don't have to think about it all the time. But, yeah, this one's a doozy, y'all. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So, the story starts off with a prologue. And you have these two men. It's presumably set in the past because of their dialect. And, you know, they sound kind of like pirates almost. Could be robbers, you know, highwaymen type of thing. And they're running away in the woods, evading capture from somebody. And they heard these dogs barking off in the distance, and they realize that they're running out of time. So they need to find a place to hide. So they see this big tree with this huge opening in the trunk of it, and they decide to kind of park themselves there. But these two black labs end up cornering them into the tree, and before we can find out what happens to them, it cuts to present day. And you see that this family is moving into this house, and the kid is looking out the window, and the kid's name is Cooper. And Cooper is, you know, kind of afraid of these sounds that he's hearing coming from outside. And, you know, you can kind of get this glimpse of his character that he gets scared by things rather easily. Well, his family is telling Cooper that, you know, they're kind of sad that he's had to move away from, you know, where they used to live, but try to make the most of it and try to get settled in into the new house and, you know, put the past behind you a little bit. But Cooper is fixated on what's going on outside. He just thinks something's off. And then it doesn't help when his brother jump scares him, you know, with a mask on, and it sends the two brothers into a fight. And his brother's name is Mickey, by the way. I think he's supposed to be older, but he doesn't look all that much older to the kid actor who plays Cooper here. But after getting into an argument, the parents say, hey, break it up, or you two are going to get in trouble before school starts. So this is a story set in the summer. So the next day, Cooper and his brother are chatting outside, and Cooper says that he heard the faint sounds of dogs barking out in the distance. And he wants to go check them out today because he doesn't know if the neighbors have dogs, and his family definitely doesn't have dogs, so he wants to go see where it could be coming from. So while exploring the woods, he's looking for tracks and stuff, and he hears some noises, and he goes to investigate, and he ends up stumbling across this girl named Fergie. Now, Fergie's name is Margaret Ferguson, but she goes by Fergie because her surname kind of, you know, allows that nickname to happen. And she already knows of Cooper because apparently she watched the move-in the day before. And while they're chatting, Fergie says something ominous to Cooper, saying, hey, you got to get out of here while you can. the people that lived in your house before you, they randomly disappeared along with their dogs, and nobody knows what happened to them. And Fergie tries to run away from Cooper, and Cooper tries to chase her down, but he gets kind of separated from her. And while Cooper's trying to make his way back to where he came from, he sees a glimpse of a dog in this water that he stops to like rinse his hands off in, and then the dogs appear out of nowhere and start chasing him back to his house. And he flags his dad down and says, "Hey, these dogs are trying to get me. They almost got me." And the dad's like, "I don't see no dogs." And Cooper is now convinced that the howling that he heard was real. The story that Fergie said must be real, and maybe these dogs have something to do with the family that disappeared. So now Cooper's all, afraid and worried. And it carries over to later that night, where he hears a noise going on downstairs. He can't sleep. So he takes a bat and he goes downstairs and he sees that these dogs have come into his house and knocked down and made a mess and knocked some stuff down in the living room and has made a mess with like a bag of potato chips. And he tries to scare them off and calls for his brother. And the dogs disappear, and then the brother is like, "Oh, look at the mess you made. You're going to get in so much trouble for this." And the parents get involved and tell him to clean up the mess and, stop making messes at the early hours of the morning. Well, the next day comes and goes, and Cooper is convinced that since these dogs are real and Fergie has, alluded that this stuff is real, that he needs to talk with Fergie about what happened. Well, Fergie comes clean the next day. She's over hanging out at Cooper's house, and Mickey's out there working out. And Fergie comes clean to Cooper that she was in on something that Mickey convinced her to do and say, but she thinks it'll be a good idea to get some revenge on Mickey a little bit. And Cooper's like, "Yeah, that'll be really nice." And then Fergie's like, "Well, what seems to be bothering you? You look like you have been shaken up." And Cooper comes clean about these dogs. And he's like, "Nobody's going to believe me that these dogs are real." And Fergie's like, "Well, I believe you." And after talking, Fergie's like, "Well, let's meet up tonight. I'll bring a flashlight. Let's go out and search the woods and see if we can find these dogs." And for some reason, them two meet later that night, and they head out into the woods. And they follow some sounds they think they hear could be related to the dogs. And of course, they let's just say they get they get ambushed by these dogs, and the dogs drag them out to the tree that we saw from the prologue, and they shove them into the tree, and they end up in this huge tree trunk under the earth. And the dogs are there, but they're in the shadows, and all you see is their red eyes, and they're now talking like humans. And they reveal that this is no ordinary tree. This is called a changing tree, and they're going to do something to Fergie and Cooper. And when we find out what happens next, it's implied that Cooper and Fergie have now become these ghost dogs. And we have no idea what happened to the people that supposedly were these dogs beforehand. So Fergie and Cooper decide to go investigate to see what could have happened to their bodies, because something must have happened to them. So they follow a scent trail and they head back to Cooper's house, and now we see these two kids who are, at least in appearance, looking to be Fergie and Cooper, but they look disheveled and kind of haggard and, what's the word to put, looking wild. And they're ravenously eating this meal that their Cooper's family has made, and Mickey's on looking at them like, this is so weird. And Dog Cooper and Fergie decide to break in the house and make their appearance known, trying to bust on imposter Fergie and Cooper. And they create this whole scene, and the family tries to kick out the dogs, but imposter Fergie and Cooper decide to chase after them because they're implied to be the dog spirits that we knew of prior to the whole Changing Tree episode. And Mickey, of course, follows them out into the woods, and the dogs, I guess the dog versions of Fergie and Cooper lead him out to this Changing Tree area and try to corner them, and the climax happens. Let's just say that. And it's implied that Cooper and Fergie may or may not have come out with their bodies again. And there's something to be said about Mickey, though, and I'll just leave it at that. And that's where the episode ends. So that's essentially the Barking Ghost, the episode. Now, one thing I think I can give a compliment to this episode, every compliment I can give to the episode, right, it's not from its own doing, but it's from the things that it cuts from the book, okay? The filler stuff about wanting to get revenge on Mickey in the book was very pronounced, and it made Cooper really annoying. But here in the truncated episode version, the annoyingness from Cooper is not prevalent. Cooper is more likable as a result because of the shedding of the repetitive I want to get a revenge trope out of the book. And it makes the episode feel more concise. As in, you know, keeping the meat of what the book had and just putting it into episode form, to even call it that. But the episode feels like it's more focused than the book was. And I can appreciate that. And that stems to Cooper too. I think Cooper's an improvement. And yeah, I think the dogs, the trained dogs here, they did a great job at selling their viciousness and stuff. If I was a kid, that would have creeped me out. And I'll give the episode that. But other than that, I have some overwhelming negatives with this episode. And while the prologue, giving some solid backstory to maybe the origins of these dogs and ghost dogs, whatever, is better than the book, at least as it offers something there, I still think there's like no exposition to why this is even a thing, how this is happening. It's never explained. And I know there's some disbelief you got to suspend at the door with some of these Goosebumps tales. I mean, a lot of kids' horror stories out there, but the lack of any explanation of anything of how this works is jarring. It's genuinely jarring. And I think even more so in the episode here than the book in some areas, because it's a truncated version of the book, right? And don't get me wrong, the book bulldozes over the context of everything too, the explanations too. But here, when you set up in like a backstory of why this is happening, but you never explain how it's happening, except when you finally get into the changing tree later on and you're talking about, oh, like, this is where this stuff happens. It's nonsense. It's very illogical, and it's kind of silly and dumb. You know, the guys who play the people in the prologue aren't good actors. Cooper's actor is kind of good, but Mickey's actor is terrible. I feel really bad for Fergie's actress because I don't think she's bad, but she has some really bad moments in this episode, y'all. The parents were fine, though, but the acting in this episode is really jarring. The music, there's a lot of goofy, dumb music in this episode for some reason. It's just really dumb. And it has like its own end credit song, too. Why? It's just, the music's terrible. And I guess I'll get into this about Charles Laser's truncating job here. Most of the time in the show, especially with the more semi-faithful adaptations like Barking Ghost is, it's faithful in the skeleton of the story, with mild changes. You know, but Charles Laser here really truncated the story down to the meat of what the book had. And it kind of just exposes the whole story and the whole concept as being something like, why was this adapted in the first place? Like, this was a season 3 episode, and it's commonly known to have bloat in it from most fans of the show. They'll tell you that season 3 is very bloated. There's a lot of episodes that didn't really need to happen. They could have put the budget somewhere else, put it in different episodes entirely. Why was this made? I cannot tell you. Budget? Probably the big factor here. It would be cheap to make. But there's not really much story here to be had. And as the story goes along, it's mostly fine until you get to the final part, kind of like the book. And I think it shares the same sins of the book. From just changing the shack to a tree still doesn't solve the context issue there. And maybe the climax is a bit better. And I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to save a lot when I want to say in the book versus episode video. But the ending to this episode is one of the biggest wet fart endings I have ever seen in Goosebumps. It's not as out of left field and jarring as the book, but it's really dumb and goofy and silly, and I just can't stand it. This episode, y'all, I'm gonna be honest. It's not as messy as the book. I'm gonna say that. But it's just so unremarkable in so many ways. It's mostly just fine when it's fine. But when it's bad, it's bad. And it kind of balances itself out to be leaning that slightly bad, slightly meh. And that's where I'm at with this episode, y'all. Like, I can't be too harsh on it because, you know, in terms of Goosebumps episodes, I think there's way worse than this. But this is definitely near the bottom. For me. Like, it's not the worst of the worst. It's like a step up from that. So from like a 0 to 5 star basis, with all those problems I have, those are medium to high issues, right? And I decided off the top I was going to deduct 2 points off. I didn't think this episode was worthy of getting a 3.5 or higher. So we're already at a 3 flat, and for the extra gut punch it gave me, for the ending being such a big wet fart, and the bad truncation, and just the blandness of the skeleton of the story to begin with, I just feel like this does not need to exist. And when I don't think about this episode, I'm much happier than when I do. But the ending itself is so bad, I'm willing to deduct another 0.2 off, and I'll give it about a 2.8 out of 5. It's not as bad as the book outright, but it's still bad in its own regards. If you have not seen this episode before, I do not recommend it to anyone. But if you are a completionist, or you're trying to see and watch and read everything Goosebumps, try this. You might dig it more than the book. You might not. You might think they're kind of even in a lot of ways. I can totally see why people group these together as like being equally bad. But there are some more redeeming things that I like in it than maybe some other people would think. But yeah, that's my thoughts on The Barking Ghost, the episode. Let me know down in the comment section if you have seen this episode before. Do you love this or do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.